The year my brother was born, my parents said the house had become too crowded for 3 children and 2 dreams. The first dream was my mother's, who had always wanted a son. The second was my father's, who believed Sinsin would one day stand where he could not. I was neither of those dreams. I was the daughter born first, the thin one with a paper chest, the one who was forever pale, forever feverish, forever told to stop costing money. So when my brother turned 10 months old, and my mother finally found a way to go south with my father to work in a furniture factory, they packed my school bag, tied my bedding with a blue rope, and left me at my grandfather's brick house near the old river embankment. I still remember the smell of that morning, damp straw, boiled sweet potatoes, and the sour diesel from the bus. Idling at the crossroad, my mother kept my brother on her hip and would not let him wriggle toward me. My father smoked too fast and would not meet my eyes at all. I stood there in the dust with my braid falling apart and asked in the smallest voice I had whether I could visit them. During summer break, my mother did not say no kindly. She never said anything kindly when it came to me. She clicked her tongue and told me not to make trouble before dawn had even finished breaking. Then she climbed onto the bus with my father and the baby and did not turn around once. The whole village said, my grandfather had a hard face and a harder temper. They said he had worked 30 years carrying stone in the quarry without ever learning how to talk gently. He was a widower with 2 persimmon trees, 6 mu of dry land, a patchy vegetable yard, and the habit of smoking in silence until the tobacco burned down to ash between his fingers. When the bus disappeared, I looked up at him because there was nowhere else to look. He did not console me. He only adjusted the sack of feed on his shoulder and said, if you keep staring after things that are gone, you will miss the road under your feet. Come home. That was his style of tenderness. I only learned its language years later. Living with him felt at first like living with a mountain. Mountains do not chat. Mountains do not ask about your feelings. Mountains do not know what to do with a girl who cries into her sleeve at night because the room smells wrong without her baby brother snoring beside the wall. My grandfather's house had 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen with a roof patched in 3 different colors of tin. The courtyard was swept clean every dawn. He rose before the crows, boiled water, fed the ducks, and tapped on my doorframe with the back of his knuckles when it was time for school. He never called my name unless he had to. Mostly he just said, up, or eat, or it is late. For the first few weeks, I answered him in nods. I did my homework at the square table, under the dim bulb, and listened to him outside pulling weeds by lantern light. Sometimes when he thought I was asleep, he would come in and stand by the bed for a while. I could tell by the way the board stopped creaking and the room grew careful. But daytime returned us to silence again. My body had always been weaker than other girls. If a cold wind passed through the village, it seemed to find me first. My classmates could run the length of the field and come back flushed and laughing, while I often stood on the edge with a stitch in my side, pretending I simply did not want to play. The women in the lane used to tell my mother that a child this light should be fed better. My mother always laughed without humor and said I was the sort who could swallow a whole chicken and still look like a broomstick. At 12, I bled for the first time. During the hottest week of summer, no one had explained anything to me. In school, the science teacher had hurried through that chapter with his face red and his eyes fixed on the blackboard. At home, there had never been any conversation about a girl's body except complaints. So when I woke to the wet warmth beneath me, I thought at first I had injured myself in my sleep. I washed the stained sheet in the courtyard with cold well water, scrubbing until my knuckles whitened. My grandfather came back from the millet plot and asked why I was wasting good water indoors. I stood there holding the dripping cloth against my chest and could not answer. My face burned so badly I thought smoke might rise from it. After a while, I gathered enough courage to ask him for 5 yuan. He frowned, not because he was unwilling, but because questions came before money. With him, what for? My throat closed. I could not say it. I stared at my bare feet and wished the earth would split open. He stared too, long enough that I thought he might get angry. Then he reached into the inner pocket sewn into his vest, pulled out a folded bill, and asked in the same rough voice, enough, no one had ever asked me that before. Need and sufficiency. Not judgment. Not scolding. Just enough. I nodded so hard my braid slapped my shoulder. The problem should have ended with 5 yuan and embarrassment, but it did not. The bleeding went on for 10 days, then 12. By the second week, I felt as if someone had scooped the strength out of my bones with a ladle. At school, the classroom swayed in and out of focus. At home, the world narrowed into the distance between the bed and the water jar. When I finally called my mother from the village shop phone, she told me not to waste telephone charges over a little women's matter. Girls are like that, she said.
Wait, 2 more days?
2 more days later, I was in the kitchen trying to stack bowls. After dinner, when the floor tilted and
rose,
I woke under a moon so bright it looked metallic. At first, I thought I was still dreaming because I was lying on old quilts in the back of my grandfather's cargo tricycle, and the stars were moving above me. Then I heard his breathing deep, strained, and uneven, and realized he was pedaling me uphill to the township clinic. The tricycle groaned with every turn of the wheel. His shoulders were so narrow under his faded shirt that they looked breakable. The night road was all gravel and silver light. I pushed myself up and said I could get down and walk, but he barked at me not to move because if I shifted my weight, he would tip the whole thing into the ditch. He shouted because he was frightened. That, too, I understood only much later. The township doctor gave me an injection to stop the bleeding and said I needed rest and better food. The child is undernourished, he told my grandfather. You can't make blood out of wind. The next morning, my grandfather boiled an egg and put it in my bowl. Without comment, the day after that, he went to the next village and came back with 2 black hens in a wicker basket. By the end of the week, there were 12 scratching in the yard. He built them a pen himself and muttered to them as if scolding them into laying more quickly. Whenever the butcher's family slaughtered a pig, he returned with a bag of liver or heart. He simmered dark soups I hated and sat across from me while I drank them, not letting me escape after 2 gulps. If I complained about the bitterness, he would put a peppermint candy on the table, but only after the bowl was empty. Summer nights in the countryside were thick with the smell of mud and crickets. The house was too hot to sleep in, so he carried a bamboo mat to the packed earth beside the fish pond and set us there head to foot under the open sky. He fanned me with a palm leaf until I dozed off. The wind he made rose from my ankles to my forehead in patient waves. Sometimes I woke in the middle of the night and saw him still sitting beside me, shirt soaked through, batting mosquitoes away from my face. Children think salvation should look heroic and obvious. A night, a miracle. A crowd of adults finally saying they were sorry. For me, salvation often looked like a row of old man in patched trousers, counting eggs by lantern light and pretending he was not exhausted. Middle school on the town ridge was far enough from the village that I had to board there. My grandfather borrowed a cousin's bicycle and tied my bedding to the back with hemp rope. We rode for what felt like half a day, climbing through a road lined with eucalyptus and red dust. Every bump jarred my spine. Every turn made the world look larger and more expensive than I had known it to be. The dormitory had 12 girls to a room, metal bunks stacked 3 high, and windows that never shut properly. Hot water came in dented kettles, sold 1 UN at a time, and if you were not quick, the first wave of girls emptied them all. The communal washroom had stalls without full doors. Privacy, there was a rumor, not a fact. By then, my body had settled into no reliable rhythm. Sometimes I bled for 2 weeks. Sometimes I went 2 months with nothing and then paid for the silence all at once. I learned to walk with my shoulders slightly bent as if apologizing to the world for occupying space. I learned to wait until everyone else had left the classroom before checking my chair. I learned how loud shame can be, even in silence. Not everyone was cruel. That was the strange grace of those years. Some people were simply kind in the practical, wordless ways that save a life. My desk mate, Wen Shiyu, once replaced my chair after I stained the seat during a history test. I had slipped out in panic, face burning so fiercely I could barely see. When I came back, my chair was gone, and hers stood in its place, already scratched, enough that 1 more mark would go unnoticed. She returned from the courtyard carrying my chair upside down, water still dripping from 1 leg. A boy asked why she was washing furniture in the middle of the afternoon. Without even looking at him, she said, because some people's mouths are dirtier than mud, and I thought I would clean something for once. She never mentioned it again. Neither did I, but she kept doing it whenever she had to. My roommate Lan Xiaodi carried me back from class one afternoon when the cramps hit so suddenly my knees folded under me on the stairs. She was small too, though stronger than she looked. She grunted the whole way and swore at me for being lighter than a sack of feathers and still somehow twice as troublesome. At night, when she thought I was asleep, she tucked the blanket more tightly around me because my feet were always cold. And every week, unless floodwater blocked the road, my grandfather came. He tied thermoses of chicken soup to the bicycle frame and pedaled more than an hour each, way. He waited by the dorm matron's office until she was willing to let him heat the soup in the little electric cooker the staff used for noodles. If the matron refused, he would stand there with his cap in both hands until she changed her mind out of irritation or
Pity.
he never came empty-handed. Chicken,
Soup.
steamed buns wrapped in cloth, dried fish, herbal medicine sealed in bags, peppermint, candy. He would set the thermos down and ask only
One thing. Any trouble? I always shook my head.
I thought I was protecting him by not telling the truth. I thought if I endured enough in silence, his burden would become lighter. Children are foolish that way.
We mistake.
Concealment for strength. What finally drove him to the school with a hoe handle in his fist was not the illness itself, but a teacher's contempt. Our mathematics teacher in the second year, Mr. Zoe, liked to speak of talent as if it were a private club and students from villages had no invitation. He enjoyed reminding us that county schools sent only a few pupils to academic high schools each year, and that most of us would eventually go where our parents were factories, fields, kitchens, early marriages. He said these things with a smile, as if they were harmless truths. I was good at
Mathematics.
good enough that even when I lost days too, bleeding and weakness, the numbers still arranged themselves into patterns I could trust. On the midterm, I ranked first in the class and third in the entire grade.
Mr.
Zoo did not congratulate me. He held my paper up by one corner in front of everyone and asked, very softly, who
Had helped me cheat.
The room froze. I was too shocked even to stand. He walked down the aisle, placed the paper on my desk, and tapped one finger against the perfect score at the top. A person with a foundation like yours does not produce this out of nowhere, he said. Ambition without honesty is uglier than ignorance. I wanted to argue. I wanted to ask what foundation meant to
Him.
mud walls, a grandfather who could barely sign his name, a body that failed me at least once a month, but my mouth refused to open. Humiliation rose in me so violently it almost felt like nausea. He made me redo every problem on the blackboard after school while he watched. I solved them all. He then said, perhaps I had memorized help from someone else, and gave me another
Sheet.
this one from an old Olympiad training pack no one in our class had.
Zine.
I solved that too, though my hands were trembling by the end. He stared at the ouncers as if they insulted him. Personally, even a blind cat catches a rat once, he said. I went back to the dorm and vomited behind
The washroom.
I did not tell my parents,
I.
did not even tell Xiaodi or Shiyu, but the homeroom teacher called my grandfather when she learned why I had cried through evening study hall. He arrived the next afternoon with mud still on his trousers and the wooden handle of a broken hoe over his shoulder. He did not raise his voice in the office. At first, that was the frightening part. He stood there in his faded jacket, looking smaller than every other adult in the room, and asked Mr. Zhu whether humiliating a child made him feel taller.
Mr.
Zhu laughed and said old peasants should mind their own business. Then my grandfather placed the hoe handle across the teacher's desk and said very clearly, if you cannot teach without stepping on my granddaughter's neck, I can show you how a man speaks without a blackboard. The vice principal stood up so quickly his chair tipped. Someone called for water.
Mr.
Zhu flushed purple and shouted about discipline.
My.
Grandfather took one step closer and said, I do not know your polished words. I only know this, if you break her spirit. In this school, I will come here every day until you explain to the whole town why a teacher is afraid of a girl's score.
I.
Had never seen him like that. He looked old, yes, but also enormous, as if the years of quarry dust and wind had condensed into something harder.
Then fear.
An apology was forced out of
Mr.
Zhu before the end of the week. It was thin and bitter and not worthy of the harm done, but it existed, and after that he never spoke to me with that same contempt. Again, the students said my grandfather was tyrannical. I heard them in the corridor, half amused and half admiring. The nickname spread for a while, the iron old man from the river village.
I.
Treasured it in secret. The summer after my second year, my parents sent word that I should come south and work during the holiday instead of rotting at home with books. Their messages were not requests. They never were. My father said one more pair of hands in the factory meant several 100 yuan by the end of the month. My mother said, since I was always complaining about money for medicine, perhaps it was time I earned some myself. My grandfather argued until his face turned the color of old brick, but he had no legal right over me and too little cash that season to say no for long. I went. The factory was in an industrial belt outside a city that smelled of hot rubber and frying oil. My parents lived in a room barely wider than 2 beds put together. The workshop floor was a single ocean of fabric scraps, fluorescent lights, and machine noise so constant it seemed to enter the blood. Children played in the aisles among boxes and hanging garments while their parents worked 14-hour shifts stitching cheap dresses for brands none of us would ever wear. My job was to trim loose threads from finished pieces and stack them by color. 3 fen per garment. Fast hands earned survival. Slow hands earned insults. I was slow, not because I did not want to work, but because the room was hot enough to soften thought. Because my lower back already ached from standing. Because my mother kept hissing at me to move quicker whenever the line manager passed, and fear makes the hands clumsier, not better. One afternoon, a buyer's representative came to inspect a batch. She was perhaps 30 with sharp heels and a voice like cool water. She paused when she saw me and asked my age. I lied immediately, saying 15. She looked at my wrists and knew I was lying. Later, during the short break, I found her smoking beside a loading dock, staring over the wall toward a strip of sky sliced by electrical wires. If you can still go back to school, she said without preamble, go back. Factory. Air makes some people money. It turns other people into dust. She flicked ash into the drain and added, almost to herself, that she had once worked a line like this too. That night, I watched my mother fall asleep. Sitting upright, a pair of unfinished cuffs still in her lap, my father snored with one arm over my brother, who had learned to talk in the city and already sounded less like home than I did. I lay awake on the edge of the bed, listening to the workshop machines next door continue past midnight. Some lives are not hell because of one great catastrophe. Some are hell because of repetition,
Thread.
cloth, overtime,
Rent.
hunger, sleep. Then again until your face grows old and your name becomes the sound of a time card. The next morning when the line manager shouted at a woman for taking too long in the toilet, I saw my future in that room, as clearly as if someone had hung it up for inspection. Not a future of dramatic suffering. A future of slow erasure. I told my parents I wanted to go back and prepare for the next school year. My mother laughed in my face. My father said if I had enough energy to dream, I had enough energy to work. That evening after the shift ended, I slipped out of the factory district and started walking in the direction of the bus station with exactly 12 yuan hidden in my sock. I never made it there. At dusk, in a market alley behind a row of shuttered shops, I saw a figure stumbling toward me in slippers, one trouser leg rolled higher than the other, a fertilizer sack slung over one shoulder. For a second, I thought desperation had produced a ghost. Then he called my childhood nickname in that rough, impatient voice, and I started crying so hard I could not breathe. My grandfather had traveled more than 500 kilometers alone. He did not know the city. He could not speak standard Mandarin well. He had asked for the furniture factory district by pointing at my father's old wage slip and repeating the town name, until some driver finally took pity on
him.
he found me before I surrendered. That night, we ate one bowl of noodles in a station stall because he insisted he was not hungry, and I knew he was lying. The next morning, he fought with my parents in the alley outside their dormitory until neighbors came to watch. I still do not know what all was said, only that in the end, he turned his back on them and told me to pick up my bedding. On the train home, he let me sleep with my head against his shoulder. Every time the carriage jolted, his hand came up at once to steady me. From then on, he stopped pretending time would always be generous. He took more work wherever he could get it, hauling sand, carrying bricks, repairing ditches, guarding orchards at night. He sold the pig earlier than planned. He sold half the winter firewood. He planted medicinal herbs between the corn rows because someone told him their roots fetched a better price in the county market. He did all this while still breeding the black hens that had become our family's private miracle. Once, during a school holiday, I went looking for him at a construction site. I found him under a yellow crane with 2 sacks of cement stacked on his shoulder frame, his spine bent into a shape that looked impossible for a living person. The foreman laughed when he saw me staring and said I should study hard because my grandfather was already too old to be carrying the mountain on his back. My grandfather immediately told the man not to talk nonsense in front of children. He always did that, taking the blade of hardship and turning it outward away from me as if I had no eyes and no understanding, as if love could function as camouflage. By the time I entered the final year of middle school, he had gathered enough money to take me to a proper city hospital. Twice, the specialist ran tests, prescribed hormone medicine, changed the prescription, changed it again, told him we had to keep watching. One doctor used words like chronic, unstable, and future fertility in a voice too careful to be comforting. Outside the consultation room, my grandfather only said the treatment would help and that I should not be afraid. Years later, I understood he had lied to protect me. At 16, I only understood that the medicine was expensive and the hope attached to it was even more so. I studied as if the books were a rope and the world below me was floodwater. Every wrong answer got copied 3 times. Every chapter became a wall to climb. I borrowed problem sets from classmates and copied them by hand because I could not afford the originals. I collected used notebooks from the teacher's office and wrote in the blank
Margins.
I asked questions until even the patient teachers began to laugh at the sight of me, appearing in doorways with another page of
Algebra.
my grades rose. 5th in the year, then 3rd, then 1st. In the mock exam before graduation, people in the village began to speak of me with pride they had not invested in earning. They said our family produced a scholar. They said perhaps a weak body hit a sharp
Mind.
They said my grandfather's stubbornness had not been foolish after all. My parents still asked mostly about my brother. Had I heard whether the city school near their factory accepted transfer students? Could I send them notes from my teachers for him? Could I remind grandfather that whatever I accomplished, it was still the family's face I was carrying I stopped expecting? The kind of love that had to be begged. 4. The entrance exam came with rain heavy, clouds and a power outage in the first mathematics session that left the classroom hot and dim. My medication made me dizzy, but it also kept the bleeding under control. When I handed in the last paper, my palms were so damp, the answer sheet felt as if it belonged to someone else. The results were released on my grandfather's 60th birthday. Relatives came to drink and advise.
They.
Always preferred advising over helping. By then, I had heard every variation of the same speech a girl could earn money with. Only junior middle school. A girl who was sick should not waste tuition. A girl ought to marry before her condition made that harder. My mother nodded along while spooning fish. For my brother, my father said little, but his silence always stood with her. Never.
With me?
Then the homeroom teacher called. My grandfather snatched the phone from my
father and demanded the result before
greetings were even finished. The teacher laughed and told him I had ranked 2nd in the entire county.
The
room changed shape in an instant. Every face that had been doubtful became
astonished.
Every mouth that had preached restraint found praise instead. My mother stared at me as though she were seeing a distant relative unexpectedly arrive rich. My father cleared his throat and said, perhaps if father insisted I could continue studying after all. My grandfather stood up with his cup of liquor in hand and said, with tears bright in his old eyes, as long as she can still pass, I can still work. That night, after the guests had gone, he sat in the courtyard under the persimmon tree and laughed to himself for several minutes.
Straight.
I had never heard a sound more victorious. I thought the hardest part would be reaching the city's best high school.
I
Was wrong. The hardest part was surviving there long enough to belong. The admissions letter came from Haicheng First High, a provincial key school where the students were the brightest from cities, counties, and prestigious private academies all mixed together. I entered on a tuition waiver so generous, it felt like a dare. By the end of the first week, I understood the gap between being first in a small pond and swimming in the sea. My classmates had spent the summer in prep courses. They spoke casually of books I had never seen in methods our county. Teachers had not had time to teach. Their shoes had brand names. Their pencil cases cost more than my monthly lunch money. They were not all arrogant, but they had been raised inside a confidence I did not know how to wear. In the placement test, I ranked near the bottom of my class. When the papers were handed back, my homeroom teacher looked at my score, then at the county listed on my file and said, in a neutral voice that schools from poorer districts were always a little behind. She meant no particular cruelty by it. That somehow made it worse. There was no villain to hate, only reality.
I owned one.
Pair of canvas shoes. When the soles peeled, I bought glue and repaired them at night on newspaper spread over the dorm floor. During a storm, both shoes filled with water on the way back from the canteen, and I sat through evening study with my socks squelching inside them, pretending not to notice the smell of damp cloth. I kept asking questions because not asking would have meant drowning, but one deskmate finally told me my fundamentals were too weak and that tutoring, not conversation, was what I needed. Private tutoring cost more than we had once spent in a month on food. Meanwhile, my body seemed determined to wage war on me at the worst possible moments. The medicine helped, but not enough. Some months the bleeding nearly vanished. Others it returned with double force. As if angry at having been restrained, I stained a chair in the classroom one afternoon and nearly stopped attending lessons altogether. The first person to notice that I was coming undone was not a close friend, but the chemistry teacher who called me to the office after lab and quietly placed a packet of sanitary pads, brown sugar, and red dates into my hands. She said she and the homeroom teacher had paid for them together. I stood there with the packet pressed against my chest and could not say thank you. My throat refused to work. She smiled as if she understood that gratitude is sometimes too full to fit through speech. A month later, the school choir performed at the Autumn Arts
Festival.
because I was short and looked presentable. In photographs, I was placed in the front row and told to wear a white dress with bare legs. I had no warm stockings. Everyone else did. Halfway through the final chorus, under stage lights and winter wind, I felt the unmistakable slide of disaster. Something dropped from under my hem to the floorboards. Heat streaked down my calf. The music continued. I kept singing because I did not know what else to do. When the piece ended, I ran. I ran up the stairwell to the rooftop, where the potted flowers had already withered from frost. The city below was a blur of concrete and traffic and a life so large it had no use. For one trembling village girl, I thought with terrifying calm that perhaps some roots were rotten no matter
How much sun reached the leaves?
Then I heard my grandfather call my name. He had come all the way to the city that very day carrying a cloth bag full of dried fish, steamed sticky rice cakes, and the medicines I had forgotten during the last holiday. He had never liked elevators and had climbed every stair to find me. He was wearing the padded jacket my aunt had bought him years earlier, the one he always said was too good for daily use. He looked at me, looked once at the roof edge, and did not panic. He only opened his bag, pulled out a still warm sweet potato, and said, "Eat first. If you still want to be foolish after that, at least do it with strength." It was such an absurd sentence that I burst into tears. He came closer then, very slowly, as if approaching a frightened calf, and wrapped his jacket around my shoulders. He told me he had saved another 5,000 yuan, enough for more tests at the provincial hospital. He said if my body wanted to misbehave, then we would drag it to every doctor in the province until it learned manners. I clung to him so tightly he must have had trouble breathing. He patted my back awkwardly and muttered that I was making a scene in the wind on. The roof was too sharp, and if I cried any harder my nose would freeze. Downstairs, the head teacher pretended not to have noticed why I had disappeared. She only said I should go to the hospital and rest, and that one spoiled performance did not define a person's life. At 16, that combination, my grandfather's refusal to surrender and my teacher's discreet mercy, was enough to return me to the world. The final 2 years of high school were a long negotiation between ambition and endurance. The diagnosis, when it finally came from the provincial hospital after months of tests, was complicated enough that I could not pronounce it properly. What mattered was this: the condition might improve with age, but it would require long-term management, regular reviews, careful nutrition, and periods of absolute rest when the bleeding became severe. The doctor also said in the measured tone adults use when they do not know how much truth a girl can bear that childbirth might be difficult for me later in life. My grandfather listened with both hands on his knees and asked only whether I would die. When the doctor said no, not if the treatment was maintained, the old man's entire body seemed to exhale. We came out of the consultation room poorer and strangely lighter. That winter, he sold 10 cedar trees from the hill behind our house. He had planted them when my grandmother was alive. They were meant, the whole family knew, to be saved for the timber of his own coffin. When I found out, I wept in the courtyard and begged him not to do things that sounded like a farewell. He laughed and said living people mattered more than dead.
Furniture.
When I am gone, he said, a mat and a pit.
Will do.
But you are still walking toward your life.
Wood can wait.
He said these terrifying things with such practicality that I learned little by little not to collapse. Every time old age showed its face, my classmates were still climbing too. That was the other hard lesson. Effort alone does not make you special in a place built from effort. Everyone there had been a champion. Somewhere else, I moved from 50th in the grade to 43rd, then to 36th, then into the top 20 by the middle of second year. Each improvement felt enormous to me and invisible to everyone else. I did not mind invisibility anymore. Not much. I had my routines: wake at 5, review, while the corridors were still blue with pre-dawn light, eat the egg my grandfather insisted I keep in a tin cup by the dorm window, attend every class as if absence itself were a luxury item, rest when the doctor's schedule said rest, never when shame said rest. My old deskmate from middle school wrote letters when she could. Xiaodi worked in a toy assembly plant by then and included stories of coworkers who saved for night
School.
when Shiyu mailed me a wool rabbit one winter with a note that said I should hold it against my stomach when cramps became unbearable. Even from different lives, they found ways to place warmth into my hands. There were also teachers who chose me in quiet ways. The English teacher let me stay in her office during lunch so I could use the electric kettle. The physics teacher gave me his stack of last year's mock tests after hearing I could not afford the current compilation. The dorm matron, who had once seemed carved from iron, eventually began leaving. The side room unlocked before dawn because she knew I liked to memorize formulas. There, where the lights never went out, I still dreamt of the factory sometimes, threads wrapping around my wrists, needles rattling like teeth, managers shouting for speed I did not have. Whenever those dreams came, I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth and studied until the fear softened into fatigue. My parents called occasionally. My mother spoke only of my brother, his grades, his appetite, his temper, his future. My father once asked whether I might transfer my scholarship stipend home because tutoring for a boy in the city was expensive. I told him no so quietly I surprised myself. The word did not kill me. After that, it became easier to say the closer I came to the university entrance examination, the more clearly I could feel time splitting in two directions. One direction rushed forward, dragging me toward the future with all its uncertainty. The other stretched backward, tethered to a village courtyard where an old man was, growing smaller under the weight of labor. He never confessed. By then his back had begun to bend for real. Not the temporary curve of effort, but the permanent shaping of years. White had taken over his hair completely. His hands shook when he threaded fishing line. Yet every month he still took me for review appointments, still tucked bills into hidden pockets inside his waistband, still argued over medicine prices with
Pharmacists as if money itself were a
Rival to be outwitted.
Once, on the train back from the provincial hospital, he leaned toward the window and said in a voice full of wonder that he had now ridden trains and subways and long-distance buses, but not yet an airplane. I suppose that is enough for one old
Farmer, he said.
I told him no. I told him when I got into university I would take him on a plane and let him look down on clouds from above, not just watch them from the fields. He laughed and asked what use a man like him had for clouds. I said perhaps no use at all, but that did not mean he should not see them. From then on it became our private promise. Whenever I faltered, he would raise an eyebrow and ask whether I had changed my mind about showing him the sky. It always annoyed me enough to make me sit back down at the desk. In the final year I lived almost mathematically, hours allocated,
Food.
Measured.
sleep protected like an exam, answer sheet in the rain. My scores rose again, though never explosively. I was not a genius among geniuses. I was a persistent climber with one good mind and no room for self-pity. Top 15 in the grade by the second. Mock. Top 10 by the third. My homeroom. Teacher stopped saying the county schools were behind. Instead, she began calling me by name when discussing resilience in class, which embarrassed me more than criticism ever had. The school doctor kept a packet of emergency medicine in her drawer with my
Name on it.
The chemistry teacher made me promise I would not reduce meals before the exam out of nerves. The dorm girls, even the ones I barely knew, left me alone during review week and stopped slamming doors after lights out. This, too, was a kind of love. Then came the days of the exam. The city was strangely cool for June, washed pale by a line of overcast mornings. I was assigned a test site in my own school, which felt like a final kindness from fate. The medication worked. My cramps stayed low and distant like thunder beyond hills. I wrote until my fingers cramped, handed in the final paper, and walked out feeling less triumph than emptiness. When you carry a mountain for years, setting it down is confusing. My grandfather was waiting at the gate with a cloth bag and an umbrella. Even though it was not raining, he did not ask how the exam had gone. I asked why, and he said because the papers were already out of my hands now, so good or bad could only be worried over by fools. Then he held up the bag and announced that he had sold the latest batch of hens and tomorrow we could go for another follow-up. At the hospital, in that moment, standing under the school archway while other students hugged their parents or shouted plans for freedom, I suddenly saw how his love had always moved. Never toward celebration first. Always toward whatever pain remained. I threw my arms around him so hard he nearly dropped the umbrella. His shirt smelled of sun, old tobacco, and the road. It is possible to be so loved by one person that all the vacancies left by others began at last to lose their power. The score release date arrived during the hottest week of the summer.
My grandfather
Had gone to help repair a village road. Because a team paid at noon, cash in
hand
by late morning, the sun had turned the air
to glass.
I carried tea out to the roadside where the men were working, stepping around. heaps of gravel, and the fresh black ribbon of tar. Several villagers were there pretending to help and actually waiting for news. They had been doing that since breakfast, trading rumors about cutoffs and scholarship lines and whether my health would ruin my chances even if my score was high. I heard one of them say, not unkindly, that the old man had poured his coffin money into a girl's education, and now we would see if heaven considered that a wise
Investment.
My phone trembled in my pocket. For a moment, I could not make my fingers work. Then I opened the message and the world went very quiet. Provincial rank 17. Admitted benchmark projection, secure for every top university I had ever dared to name aloud. I must have made some sound because all the men turned at once. My grandfather straightened from the roadside, tar brush still in hand, sweat shining in every crease of his face. He looked afraid, not of bad news, but of hope, too large to trust. I walked toward him one step at a time and told him. He said nothing at first. He just stood there under the noon sun, the old brush hanging from his fingers. And then his knees folded so abruptly that everyone shouted, but he was not collapsing. He had gone down into a squat the way old farmers do when emotion becomes too big to contain. Standing up, he covered his face with both hands and laughed and sobbed and cursed me for frightening him in one breath. The road crew boss clapped him on the back. Someone set off leftover festival firecrackers. A woman ran home and came back with a basin of sweet well water because apparently success required drinking from clean things. By evening, the whole village knew before my parents did. My father called after sunset. His voice shook with excitement in a way I had not heard directed toward me in my entire life. He said he had always known I would make something of myself. My mother got on the line to say that perhaps her strictness had been useful. After all, that self-reliance must have made me strong. I listened until she finished and then handed the phone to my grandfather. He did
Not insult them.
that would have been easy. He only said in a voice calm enough to cut iron if a tree bears fruit in drought. Do not tell the orchard it was your rain. Then he hung up. The admission packages came from 3 universities. I chose the medical university in the provincial capital, not because I wanted revenge against illness, but because I wanted the kind of knowledge no girl should have to beg strangers for. I wanted to understand the body that had ruled so much of my childhood. I wanted to stand one day in a white coat and speak to frightened daughters in words that did not turn them into burdens. Tuition was mostly covered by scholarship. The village committee, suddenly proud to be associated with me, arranged a modest award. My former high school added a
Stipend.
My parents offered money too, perhaps out of embarrassment, perhaps because success made generosity safe. I took only what I needed for travel and books. The summer before university, I finally insisted on giving something back immediately. I used my scholarship advance to buy my grandfather a real mattress to replace the reed mat he had slept on for years. He scolded me for wasting money until I pointed out that a man intending to live to 100 ought not sleep like a field hand forever. Then I bought him a suitcase. He laughed so hard at that, he had to sit down. A suitcase for what? To carry sweet potatoes onto the bus for the plane, I said. He thought I was joking until the day I showed him the tickets. He touched the glossy paper with the cautious reverence of someone handling a legal decree from heaven. Then he spent 3 days asking every person in the lane what one was supposed to do in the sky if one needed the toilet. The airport was in a city so clean and polished that my grandfather lowered his voice automatically, as if noise itself might be charged by the minute. He wore the same padded jacket he had worn to rescue me on the school roof years earlier, though now I had bought him a new shirt and a pair of leather shoes soft enough for his swollen feet. He carried the little suitcase himself, despite my protests, and kept checking the ticket in his chest pocket every few minutes to make sure it had not fled. At security, he nearly handed over the peppermint candies in his pocket as if they too required inspection. On the escalator he gripped the rail with both hands and muttered that moving stairs were one step too far for civilization. In the waiting hall, he stared at the planes as if they were improbable beasts that somehow had been convinced to cooperate with humans. When we finally took off, he sucked in his breath so sharply that I worried his heart would leap out through his ribs. Then the plane rose above the city, above the roads, above the river that had once seemed the whole width of the world. Clouds spread outside the window like endless cotton fields lit from within. My grandfather turned to me very slowly. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. So this, he said, is what it looks like when the sky is below you. I leaned my head against his shoulder the way I had on that train home from the factory and said, yes. For most of the flight, he looked outside, without speaking. Once he pointed at the shadow of the plane on the clouds and asked whether that was us. Once he laughed quietly to himself and said my grandmother would never have believed such a thing. Once he patted my hand and told me not to waste tears on him if he died tomorrow, because he had now seen enough for 3 lifetimes. I told him not to talk.
Nonsense.
He replied that promising to live to 100 and actually doing it were different matters, but then he added, in the same breath, that perhaps one must keep trying if a girl still had so many places left to take him. University began in a rush of orientation. Speeches, anatomy atlases, scholarship, forms, and hostile corridors smelling of disinfectant. My grandfather helped me make the bed, placed the thermos on the desk as if establishing a frontier outpost, and told me new roommates I disliked cold things and false politeness, and that if they ever saw me faint they should call me by my full name because it made me angrier and therefore more likely to wake. Before he left, he stood awkwardly beside the dorm entrance, not quite sure what farewell suited a granddaughter who had stepped into a different world. I solved it for both of us by hugging him. First, he patted my shoulder, glanced around as if embarrassed to be seen sentimental, and then said the same thing he had said on the day my parents left me with him all those years ago. Watch the road under your feet. I watched him walk away across campus, a small old man with a straightened back, carrying an empty suitcase under one arm, and my whole childhood folded inside him somewhere. Invisible. People often ask later, what changed my
Fate?
They expect a dramatic answer.
Genius.
Luck. A teacher's special favor.
Scholarship.
A turning point. Perhaps all of those matter a little, but the truest answer is simpler. A girl can survive a great deal of neglect if even one person refuses to look away. One person who asks not whether she is expensive, but whether she has enough.
One
Person who pedals through moonlight to a clinic. One person who carries soup uphill. One person who believes a county child belongs in a city classroom. One person who would sell the timber of his own coffin to keep her future alive. One person who says again and again, with no poetry and no softness, that she must go on. My grandfather was that person. Years later, when I stood in a hospital ward as a young resident physician, explaining a diagnosis to a frightened girl and her silent old guardian, I heard my own voice grow gentler than I had intended. I showed them where to buy medicine cheaply. I wrote down the schedule in large, neat characters. I walked them all the way to the payment desk. That night, after my shift ended, I called the village and listened to my grandfather complain that the hens were laying poorly and the persimmon branches needed pruning, and the neighbor's grandson was too noisy to amount to much. Under every complaint lay the steady rhythm of life, still there, still holding. When I finally went home for the new year, the wild rose by the courtyard wall was in bloom. It had been black at the root once, nearly given up for dead. Now it climbed the bricks in a flare of impossible red. My grandfather stood beside it with a basket of feed and said, as if continuing a conversation we had never stopped, see, some things survive because they are stubborn. Some survive because someone keeps watering them. Most survive because of both. I looked at him, at the rose, at the house that had once felt like a place of exile and had long since become the center of everything. Good, I understood, and I knew he was right. The world had not been fair. My body had not been easy. My parents had not learned how to love me, but I had been kept. And because I had been kept, I could go on, keeping light for others.